Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for the first session in the series of Collaborative Teams that Work webinars with Gavin Grift and Colin. For those of you who aren't aware about Hawker Brownlow, since 1985 we have empowered F to 12 teachers and educational professionals with the tools and skills, such as these webinars, to achieve classroom and raise student achievement. My name is Thea Dupay, and I'm the Managing Director of Professional Services at Hawker Brownlow Education, based in Melbourne. I will be your moderator for this session. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Gavin Grift and Colin. Gavin Grift connects with national and international audiences through his keynotes, seminars, and coaching services on how to cultivate authentic collaboration, build success in others, and genuinely commit to reflective practice. Having taught in schools and coached educators for over 25 years, Gavin understands the specific challenges teachers face. Colin Sloper is a leading expert and author on professional learning communities. Colin works with systems, schools, leaders and educators to transform them into high-performing professional learning communities and build their capabilities to operate as members of a highly effective collaborative teams. He is co-author of numerous books, and as a principal, Colin was instrumental in leading his school to become the first recognised PLC at Work school in Australia, which subsequently led him to supporting other systems and schools across the country in their PLC journeys. And so with that, I'll pass you over to Gavin and Colin.
Thanks, Thea.
Hi, welcome everyone.
Yes, thanks, Cole. I was just going to welcome everybody, and lovely to see just in the attendees there some people that we recognise and have worked with, and some maybe people that we haven't. So if it's hello again or it's a hello for the first time, welcome to this webinar. We're really looking forward to it. For Colin and I, this is really just spending an hour talking about something that we're extremely passionate about and have been doing over some time. So welcome, we look forward to working with you. So in this session, we're going to be outlining the work of collaborative teams. Well, over the 3 sessions, we're really going to be looking at the work of collaborative teams. But in this session, we're going to dive deeper into what it is and what makes it successful from a particular standpoint, which I'll explain in a moment. This series is designed to give you a bit of a roadmap, and in that roadmap, what we'll do in this is provide you with 6 requirements needed for collaborative teams to thrive. So I think, speaking from experience, that part, Thea, thank you for your lovely introduction too, but just in that introduction, you're talking about sort of drawing from our experiences. And in this session, Colin and I both are going to frame up what we would argue and propose are 6 absolute requirements needed for collaborative teams to thrive in a PLC. And it's the reason we're starting here, because in terms of session 2, when we'll dig deeper into the tips to ensure the success of your collaborative teams, it almost presupposes that what we go through in this first session is understood at a deep level. So we'll do that. And then we'll lead towards session 3, which will be more the people aspect, and give you 5 ways to create the conditions for people to collaborate successfully. And again, across all of these sessions, they're really for us what have become the non-negotiables for building that collaborative culture in that way. So by the end of today, if we just dig deeper into session 1, the first thing we're going to be looking at is to explore the difference between a professional learning community and collaborative teams. Critical. So we would hope by the time we've finished, every attendee leaves here with complete clarity around, well, what's the difference when we use this term professional learning community and collaborative team, and what must we remember to ensure that gives our collaborative teams the best chance for success. Number 2, moving that out the way, understood that the 4 critical questions that underpin the work of collaborative teams. What we're going to do is, many people may know of the 4 critical questions associated with particular the PLC at Work process, but what we want to do is help you develop clarity around how they relate to action research that sits at the heart of the whole collaborative team process. And number 3, learn the true work and focus of high-performing collaborative teams. And just as a matter of interest, that number 3 will weave its way through actually all 3 sessions, not just this session. So that's what we've got in store for you in this session. So where a lot of this work comes from, Colin and I are extremely excited. I think this book has been nearly 12 years in the making, Cole, in some ways.
Yeah, I think so.
But it's due to be out in December. So a lot of what this is a synthesis of the research, the experiences, the ideas and the work that we have gathered and acquired working with people such as yourselves, our colleagues who are here on this webinar, and put it into a process to just help. It really is the how. So many of the questions for us has been, but how? And so we thought, well, there's a lot on the why and there's a lot on the what, but we wanted to write something that gave people a genuine roadmap on the how, and that's what that book is, and a majority, if not all, of the work that we share with you over the 3 sessions will certainly be derived from that body of work.
So what we're going to do is start off by looking at developing a clear definition of what a PLC is. So what we'll get you to do, first of all, is to jot down what your definition of a PLC is. Now, you can either do this on a piece of paper or in chat. And if you do it in chat, as you're jotting it down, have a read of other people's definitions, because what we'd like you to do is to look for similarities and differences that you're noticing in the definitions that people are recording. So we'll give you a little time there to go into chat and to just write down what your perception, your definition of a PLC is, a professional learning community.
Okay, so I have a look, and as some people start putting them in, thank you, Catherine, great to hear from you. Groups of individuals working together, group of educators that meet regularly, sharing expertise, work collaboratively, improve teaching skills and academic performance of students. Individuals working in a team with a common goal informed by research in the cohort, working collaboratively. Educators working together to improve teaching. Thanks, Joe. Sharing of strengths and resources. Professionals actively sharing new learnings to evolve and improve teaching. Thanks, Michelle. And Kathy. Amal, teachers working together to improve the department and share ideas to building capacity. A team working together to improve teaching and learning. Developing a line of inquiry or practice that will form a common goal that will guide future action and be determined by the effectiveness based on data. So to improve student outcomes. Okay, for me, a PLC is an interdisciplinary group that works together to create. Thanks, Simone. Exchanging teacher strategies and best practice. This is a good exercise in reading quickly as it disappears off my chat. People who share dialogue and listen to each other. Student-centred focus from teams of teachers, building the capacity of all members of the team, data-driven. A group of teachers that work together to develop their teaching and therefore improve student outcomes. Thank you, Anna. I think you'll be really interested in what we're about to propose. Analyse and discuss students' assessment and results. So, Colin, just coming through there, I'll let some others come through and they can read those as they come through, but a lot centering on teaching and learning. Obviously, working together is a big theme that's come through this. Some mention of data. And results, but probably the biggest one is groups of people working together collaboratively to improve sort of student outcomes, but also to look at teaching practices seems to be the theme here, and to share our expertise. Thanks, everyone. It'll be really interesting for you as we go through this. Just keep having a look at chat, and we'll draw some conclusions. Over to you, Cole.
Thank you. As people are reflecting on what they wrote down of their definition for a PLC, would like you also to consider what would your colleagues have written down? How aligned would their thinking be around what is that basic definition of a PLC? As Gavin mentioned before, we're strongly influenced by the work of Dufour, Ecker, Manny and Mados from Learning by Doing and their work around PLCs at work. And here's the definition that they proposed in Learning by Doing. A professional learning community is educators committed to working collaboratively in ongoing process of inquiry and action research in order to achieve better results for the students they serve. And just some of those comments that Gavin read out from the chat have elements of that definition. In our book, we've actually expanded a little bit further on the basic definition that the Dufours have given us there from Learning by Doing. And we have defined a professional learning community as educators committed to working collaboratively using action research and recurring collective cycles of learning to inquire into and increase the impact of their teaching practice to achieve better results for the students they serve. If we lay those two definitions side by side, as you can see, there are some really strong commonalities between the two definitions, and the definition we've generated certainly draws and builds on the work from Learning by Doing. So it has a strong element of educators working collaboratively. The foundation is this work is not done in isolation, but teams working together and schools working together. You'll see in the middle of the definition there, it talks about ongoing process, inquiry and action research. We use a very similar definition, action research and recurring collective cycles, but we've actually qualified why you're doing that and why teams would be doing that and schools would be doing that. It's to inquire into and increase their impact of their teaching practice. And of course, to achieve better results for the students they serve. In the definition, and it's really important in terms of clarity of this work and all team members and all school members having crystal clarity about what this concept is. The definition talks about the what, okay? What are we going to do? We're going to work collaboratively. It talks about the how we're going to do it, and over the 3 sessions, we're going to dig deeper down into this piece, this how, what teams are actually doing and what schools are doing when they're conducting action research and recurring cycles of learning. And of course, we do that to impact our teaching practice, okay, to improve our teaching practice. Why? Because we know from all the research around the world that that is the only way of improving the results of the students we serve.
So let's have a look at the most important word here. I want you to just have a bit of a play on this. So, Colin, we can just go to the next slide for a moment. Thank you. So what do you see as the most important word? I'd love you. So I've just got the definition there. Would you be and put it in chat if you can, or if you're able to. If you're sitting back sort of on the couch with a cup of tea and you're not able to, that's fine too. But if you could, what do you see as the most important word in that definition? Okay, Rebecca, you've got committed. We've got impact, Matthew, thank you. Recurring inquiry, students, yeah, absolutely. And clearly in terms of who you're doing it for. Collaboratively, committed, student, impact, thank you. Cycles, collaborative. Interesting, isn't it? So people are continuing to put it down there. Well, we're going to propose something to you here as you keep going. There's many different versions, Cole. I know you can't see the chat, but we've got a whole range from learning to serve to students to inquire, because clearly each of these words are important. In fact, what we propose through this whole session is that there are 6 key words that if real collaborative teams thrive at the highest level, then people who are part of those teams and that school community needs to each have clarity around these 6 pieces we would propose. In fact, in our experience, the schools that have are the ones who make the bigger difference to learning for students and their teachers. But the most important word we would propose here is committed. Because try to do any of those things in that definition, including working collaboratively when we're not committed to, and we come up with challenge after challenge after challenge. In fact, one of the things that we would argue the schools who are applying this at the highest level are doing is from a whole school level committing to the mission of this work, the vision of this work, and the collective commitments of this work. That means that we're going to continue to push through even when it gets really hard. And I think that would really speak to everybody on this webinar. So when we talk about committed, what we're talking about is committed means having such a belief in something that you are willing to devote your time and energy into carrying it into action. And I'll be honest, a lot of the colleagues that we've worked with don't necessarily have the highest level of belief that collaboration is something they have to buy into. And then for others, it's a continuum. And for others, they're off the charts in their belief. But committed means that we have such a belief in the power of collaboration for all students and the difference we can make collectively when we do, that we will commit to this definition even when it gets tough. But going further from that, it means staying loyal to what you said you were going to do long after the mood you said it has left you. And I think that will resonate with everybody here on the webinar, because as you know, this work should get challenging and hard because we're constantly trying to work out ways in which we can take it next, whether that be restructuring or whether it be what we're focusing on our work or whether it be, what we actually need to refine as part of our practice. But whatever it is, even when it gets hard, our test of commitment is that we continue to commit to it even long after that mood has left us. Okay, so just summing up here, when confronted with a challenge, the committed heart will search for a solution. The undecided heart searches for an escape. And to us, it's the word commitments that the most important, because in a way it's what separates a PLC light school from an authentic PLC school. It's in the word committed. It's committed to collaboration, it's committed to action research, it's committing to the teaching practice, and it's committed to increasing learning for all students. Without commitment, we would argue nothing happens. Some things happen, and things will happen in pockets, and there'll be pockets of excellence and commitment within the school. But of course, collectively across the schools, we try and cultivate this collaboration. It's sometimes dressed up as something different, but it remains the same.
What we're going to do, Gavin's mentioned there are 6 key components, and he's looked at one of those components, and really the most important one in terms of building that commitment. Through this process, we're going to actually go back and dissect the definition and look at the key elements of that definition. The reason we're doing that, because you can't build commitment unless there is clarity, unless people are absolutely crystal clear and have a common understanding of what the work involves. It's very hard to have people commit to it. What tends to happen, you'll have people starting to do it through compliance because people are nice people and they want to do the right thing and do what the school's telling them to do. But you'll never get the results that you can get if you work through compliance as opposed to working through commitment. Michael Fullen reminds us that terms travel easily, but the meaning of those underlying concepts do not. So one of the things that we strongly advise as schools are transforming into PLCs and continuing to do the work is the need to constantly come back and revise and check the clarity of understanding of the people doing the work to make sure they haven't taken a seductive detour or gone off track. The fours also remind us that it's difficult enough to bring those concepts to life when there is that shared understanding. It's absolutely impossible when there's no common understanding. So one of our key learnings from today's session is we want you people to be able to walk away having clarity around what the key 6 elements of the definition are, so that when you're talking in your schools, you can start to build the clarity of others you're asking to do this work with you. If we go back to the definition again, we can see, as Gavin's mentioned, there are 6 key components of that definition. The committed we've already looked at. So let's start to look at the other ones there. And the first one I'd like to look at is this working collaboratively. In my work in schools, I often ask them to consider and challenge them to come up with a definition of collaboration. And one of the key things this identifies to me is that it is the bane and the curse of the definition itself. The word collaboration already has a definition that exists in English, yet in the definition of a PLC, it's used slightly differently. So quite often people will come up with a definition, and we've gone to that trusted source of Wikipedia for this one. Collaboration is a process of 2 or more people or organisations working together to complete a goal to complete a task or to achieve a goal. Now, people feel really proud when they've got words similar to that they've written down saying that's the definition of collaboration. But tonight we'll challenge you and say, well, in a PLC, that isn't the definition of collaboration. Well, it is, but it's more than that. So again, looking at the definition of collaboration from learning by doing, collaboration is a systematic process in which we work together. That's the same as the Wikipedia definition, but there's more to it than that. It is to work interdependently to analyse and impact professional practice in order to improve our individual and collective practice, in order to improve our individual and collective results. Now, whilst that sounds like a mouthful, what it's really doing is pointing the collaboration that a team, the methods a team will use in a certain direction. Collaboration in a PLC is more than just coming together to do a number of tasks. In a PLC, the collaboration is really focused on analysing and impacting or improving professional practice. And why do we do that? So that when I leave that collaborative team meeting, my own individual practice has been improved, a collective practice has been improved, so that the students in my class benefit from my improved practice and the students in our cohort benefit from that improved practice. So collaboration allows teachers to capture each other's fund of collective intelligence. Gavin often in working in schools uses the concept that a collaborative team is a problem-solving team. And what we need to do is make sure we're harnessing that collective intelligence of every team member as we pursue what are the best teaching practices, teaching strategies we can employ to make sure our students learn the things we want them to learn.
So, Colin, just before we go into the next sort of requirement around action research, remembering everybody, what we're doing here is we never take for granted what these terms mean, and we always look for opportunities to over-communicate them in the schools that we're working with, or, to encourage those we're working with to do the same. Because as soon as this gets murky, and you could see it yourselves, everybody has an opinion on what's the most important or what PLCs are defined as. So what we're trying to do is have some non-negotiables to say we can have all of those opinions and thoughts, but fundamentally we need to believe that that's what collaboration means in our school. Because if you accept what Colin was just speaking about in terms of collaboration in your school, then what we're accepting is that we can only get better when we work together and we rely upon one another to do so. That's the interdependent nature of that. And that requires us to work in a particular way, which we'll flag at the end of this session and go into a lot more depth in session 2, because it informs the work that we then actually do. And that's what we want to talk to you a little bit more about. So the next part that becomes critical is this notion of action research in regards to what do we mean by action research, because I think you'll also agree that in education and in schools that gets referred to in many different ways, and it does have some different contexts that can be applied to. So to get some clarity around that one as well, we'll look a bit deeper into that. Action research, if you think about it in this way, taking a quote directly from Richard Sagor, who was synonymous with this work, particularly early on in the piece, he said it was a disciplined process of inquiry, conducted by and for those taking the action. So the primary reason, not the only, but the primary reason for engaging in action research is to assist the actor in improving and or refining his or her actions. And of course, in our situation, what we're referring to in terms of the actor is the educator. So the primary reason for engaging in action research is the educator in improving and refining his or her teaching practice. I think one of the maybe the word here that can get glossed over is that word primary, the primary reason. Because what it's saying is the action research that you're embarking on in your teams, in your schools that you're calling collaborative teams or professional learning teams or whatever you're referring to them as, their primary reason is to assist the educator in improving and supporting and refining their teaching practice. And of course, the benefits that comes from that is immense, but we'll talk about that later. Okay, so the action research cycle going around, I just want to, this is a general action research cycle that's true for all models, and Colin and I have researched a lot of action research models, not just in education, but mainly in education that are out there. And they seem to be saying very similar things. One is you've got to identify a problem to be studied. 2, collect data on the problem that you've identified and ensure that it is actually a problem. 3, research possible options for addressing the problem. 4, develop a plan to address the problem. So what are we going to do about it? And then 5, we implement the plan. So there's a lot of work that gets done before we implement the plan. And then 6, of course, we evaluate the results of the actions that we take. And what we'll do a little bit later in this session, we'll make a strong connection between this action research cycle and the work of those 4 critical questions we spoke about and what this means for teams who are engaging in this work at the highest level. Okay, so summarising, there is no research without action and there is no action without research. And that almost becomes the mantra of the collaborative team. There's no research without action. So we've got to do something about this so we can learn from it, which constitutes, the research. It's the analysis of that is the research. But of course, there's no action without research, because what we're wanting to do is make informed decisions based on what we know is making a difference and what isn't making a difference. So collaboration and action research, we're trying to give you here clarity around what we have found to be the most, the strongest, almost non-negotiables for that language, but we're going to move into the third.
And already you can see some issues would be arising. Imagine if your team members are thinking when they're collaborating and they're coming together that their main focus is just to get tasks done. Yes, the team is going to be getting tasks done, but it's put through this framework so they understand that the primary work that we're doing here is action research to improve our teaching practice. In the definition, we also talk about recurring collective cycles of learning. So let's just define what we mean by cycles of learning. So to us, a cycle of learning is a unit of instruction that focuses on a particular sequence of teaching, usually focused on delivering the skills, the knowledge, or the dispositions related to a prioritised standard or standards. Now, we deliberately use this term cycle of learning to remind members that the outcome of the cycle is educating learning and student learning. Quite often when I go into schools and we talk about the concept of PLCs and professional learning communities, the L in professional learning communities, the L for learning, is around student learning, without them understanding that this whole concept is about educator learning and how that then plays out and impacts on student learning. So a cycle of learning is just that sequence of teaching, that unit of work that we're going to be delivering anyway. We're already going to be teaching this stuff. What we're doing in the PLC process is actually setting it up in such a way that what we were going to do anyway becomes the source or the focus of our action research.
Right, and I remember in the book what Colin and I do, because we know in schools this is difficult and contexts differ between schools, contexts differ within schools. And so what we're wanting to make sure that everybody understands is that we're trying to work towards that model, if you like, of a cycle of learning, because that's where you're going to get biggest bang for your buck, because that's the work we're already doing and that's what we do day in, day out. And so we're trying to work through a process, even when we structure our teams or even as we're working strategically towards different structures in our school, to ensure that becomes the core way. But we understand that's not always the way. So we do have some other information, particularly in the book, but we may sort of draw on next week to help you in that space as well. So the next piece of definition, which is really important, and I think, and Colin was actually very influential in my thinking on this, a bit of history, but worked with his school way back in the day as their PLC consultant. And I think it came clearer to us that what we needed to do more of was create recurring collective cycles of learning in the school to ensure that we all learnt from the work that we were doing. It just didn't sit with that cycle of learning that Colin mentioned. So what we mean by that, if we just go forward here, Cole, just a little bit, the implementation of action research by a team to continually identify, investigate and implement the best teaching practices to improve student learning. But again, highlighted here in yellow, practices that prove to be highly impactful are carried into the next cycle of learning and become part of the pedagogy of the individual and the team. And I think this is anecdotal, and Colin and I both have found this in our work with schools, but our observations have been that sometimes that's the bit where it falls short. It stays with the cycle of learning, or it stays within that cycle of inquiry that the team has worked on. But at the highest level, when we're cultivating a collaborative culture that's making a difference to more educators and students more often, one cycle informs the next. In fact, it can look a little bit like this if you think about it visually. You have a cycle of learning. When that cycle of learning or unit of instruction is finished, the learning from that cycle of learning informs the next cycle of learning, and then the next and the next. And you can see that these circles are getting bigger because the impact you're having as a result of this is getting bigger and bigger as well. And the 12 tips that we give you in the next session in this series will be directly aligned to the things that almost all teams need to be doing if they want to sort of have this impact on their teams as they go through. So these recurring collective cycles are important. True education is kind of a never-ending story. It's a matter of continual beginnings, of habitual, I love that term, habitual fresh starts, of persistent newness. And so even inherent in that quote is this becomes a motivator. And I've seen this. I've been at such a privilege to work along teams where, and you will have experienced this, I'm sure, in your schools or with your teams, those high-performing teams where it doesn't matter who's on the team or what you're working on, there's just this motivation and engagement because what you are doing is creating such a freshness, such an engagement and such a great vibe as you continue to build synergy in your team and move forward. I mean, a journey gets used so often in education, it becomes there's a risk of it becoming cliche. But it is that, isn't it? It's a journey. That's what it is. And I think that's what's encapsulated here. So it's important that when we work to build collaborative teams and ensure that they work within this broader concept of a PLC, that we understand this recurring nature of them, because there's power in that message.
In the definition, we also talk about and use the word inquire. So collective cycles want to inquire into and increase the impact of teaching practice. So let's just define what we mean by the word inquire. It's to ask questions, to investigate, to explore and examine evidence to determine which teaching practices are having the greatest impact on student learning. It requires an open mind, a curious spirit, and a belief in the capacity of both the educator and students to learn and improve continually. So in using the word inquire itself, there's a whole lot of dispositions that team members would require to have to be able to actually to openly inquire, I think, in terms of the level of trust that needs to be developed as you're doing this work. If we're going to, really interrogate someone's teaching practice and really put teaching practice under the microscope, then we have to have high levels of trust. If I'm a teacher in a team and feel like I'm going to be criticised or critiqued on my teaching practice, I have to know that there is good intent from the people who are doing this. The intent is to, assist me and support me in my growth as a teacher. Why? So that the students in my class continue to benefit from my improved teaching practice. So in Inquire, we're really talking about a range of dispositions that need to be there to understand that, we might not necessarily come up with the best answer, but we're certainly going to keep investigating and looking and trying to determine what possible options we may have here to be able to actually improve student learning.
I think, Colin, just to interrupt you there, Anthony Mohammed, our colleague, who I think we quoted earlier on, but I think his work here is helpful when he talks about a healthy and a toxic culture. And what you're talking about there in the inquiry is, are we a group of problem solvers or are we a group of complainers? Do we spend 10% of our time admiring the problem and 90% of the time trying to find solutions, or is it the other way around? And I think I think this has been your experience too, both when we're in teams as well as when we're working with teams and supporting teams, is this notion of inquire is a learnt skill and it takes time. And it's the human element to the process, because teams can fall down even with the greatest intent in the world by how we go about inquiring. And we'll again give you 5 clear delineated tips on how to get better at inquiring, which is a big part of the success of a collaborative team in session 3.
Beautiful. And inquiry is more important than the answers, for it's those questions we ask and the way in which we ask them that defines us. So really, if we take that concept that you just mentioned, Gav, that a collaborative team is a problem-solving team, and inquiry sits at the heart of this work because it's based on an open-mindedness, a willingness to explore, a willingness to try different alternatives to get that result that, the individual and the team is desperately trying to get in terms of raising student achievement.
Okay, so that term inquiry serves us well, and in some of the teams that we've worked with, even having teams of people talk about what they mean by inquire and what the behaviours of inquiry look like can be really important to teams. Because if we're going that step further, why are we doing this? And again, we're framing these up this afternoon as essentials because they are. And everybody in the collaborative team knows that the core work or the platform or the primary reason we're doing this work is to increase the impact of our teaching practice. That's why we're here. And to be honest, in my experience, it hasn't always been the case. Not everybody in all teams that I've worked with understand that, nor are they doing the work that's doing that. And so it's difficult for them sometimes to make the shift. But it is essential that if we're going to work in collaborative teams that impact student learning on each other, that we understand that the primary reason for doing it is to just see the impact of what we're doing and whether it's making a difference on students or not. So in regards to that, thanks, Cole, just the instructional strategies, how we describe, because teaching practice, again, how do you describe that? Well, we describe it as the instructional strategies, the approaches, and the behaviours that teachers use through the teaching and learning process. So it's about our strategies and the way we go about it, but it's also about our dispositions and who we are as teachers. And what we do is we put that under the microscope in a trusting environment to inquire into where might be the opportunities to move, push, nudge, refine, replicate, share with others what we're doing that's making a difference to our students. And the majority of the work done in collaborative teams and our model for this work to help teams really does centre around that piece, monitoring monitoring the impact of our instruction. So summing up, more important than the curriculum is the question of the methods of teaching and the spirit in which the teaching is given. Curriculum is critical. Assessment is obviously critical to the teaching and learning process. But how we operationalise that, we would argue, is the most critical. And so what we're doing is, in our collaborative teams, putting those methods under the spotlight, and in the spirit of collaboration, working out how we can continue to evolve so that the students can grasp and understand the curriculum we're intending to teach at a much deeper level.
And of course, the reason we're doing this and describing those 6 key elements of this definition, those actual non-negotiables, as Gav's described them, is to achieve better results for the students we serve. That's the whole purpose, the outcome we want of this process. So by putting this work together, by understanding, having crystal clarity about what those terms mean, ensuring that our colleagues are crystal clear about what it means, the whole school is committed to the processes that sit behind those 6 things. Our aim is to make sure that we are achieving better results for the students we serve.
And just on that, Colin, sorry, with the serve word, that serve word's been controversial or provocative, I should say, in a lot of the work we've done in schools. But that word serve is deliberate, and the body of work that is professional learning community, it requires a particular approach to leadership. So for those of you in this call who are leaders in your schools, it draws on a whole range of different leadership frames, theories and approaches. In our book, 5 Ways of Being, we draw some of those together, whether it be distributive leadership or quiet leadership or servant leadership. These are the leadership models, and there are attributes to each of those ways of leading that really support what Colin and I are talking about here. It actually demands of us as leaders to operate in this particular way. And that is why we've actually got that, or really resonate with that word serve in the definition. Okay, so the link back to the 4 critical questions. Cole.
No worries. Gavin mentioned these before, and I'm sure most of our people tuning in today will have an awareness of what those 4 questions might be. One of the things I've discovered, and I know Gavin also in working in schools has discovered, that these critical questions can be a godsend or the bane of our life in the way that they're actually operationalised by teams within a PLC, because we're warned that collaboration alone will not guarantee that a school gets better results. That collaboration has to be focused on the right work. And the 4 critical PLC questions are an attempt to make sure that we're identifying and focusing on the right work. Dufour again Rick Dufour mentions that the questions an organisation poses and the efforts and energy spent in the pursuit of the answers not only communicate priorities, but turn members in a particular direction. So the 4 critical PLC questions are absolutely vital in making sure the team is heading in the right direction. Those questions are framed up around curriculum, assessment, and instruction, as we'll see in a few moments. John Hattie also reminds us that these are the questions that are, critical for professional learning communities, data teams, collaborative teams, whatever form of collective responsibility is in our school. No matter what we label it, it's these questions that articulate the real work of a collaborative team in a PLC. So let's look at those questions. The first question is, what do we want our students to learn? That's clearly the curriculum question. Teams making sure when they're going into a cycle of learning, a unit of instruction, that they're crystal clear about what it is they want their students to learn as a consequence of that cycle of learning. Question number 2 is, how do we know our students are learning? Clearly, that's our assessment question. If this process that we've described is a process of measuring impact, then we need to have some way of measuring that. And we don't want to do it with something unrelated to the teaching process. So we use the assessment that we're gathering on student learning as an indicator of how strong our teaching practice is. Question number 3 is predicting that, what are we going to do if some students don't learn? Going into a cycle of learning, a unit of work, we can predict some students will not learn these things. If we can predict it, how are we going to plan for that to try and overcome it so that doesn't become the outcome of the cycle of learning? And of course, the converse of that is, how are we going to enrich and extend the learning of students who are already proficient? What happens if we've got this unit of work that we say is going to be for the next 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and after 2 weeks, some of the students have already mastered the key skills, knowledge and dispositions we wanted them to master, which were a focus of this cycle of learning. So what are we going to do there? We've got some opportunities to really dig deeper and enrich and extend the learning of those students. Gavin before introduced you to that cycle of learning, that action research cycle there of identifying the problem, collecting data. The PLC questions, those 4 critical PLC questions, are an attempt to kind of outline that action research, that inquiry cycle. Question 1 sits at that beginning. What's our problem to be studied? We want to know, what it is we want these kids to learn. Question 2 is really about what data are we going to collect on that problem? How are we going to monitor our impact? How are we going to know that we've achieved what we wanted to achieve? And question 3 and 4 fall down in that last phase of the that's action research or cycle of learning, developing the plan and implementing the plan. So the 4 questions from the PLC at Work model are really a simple attempt to describe action research in a cycle of learning. I sometimes go into schools and see that at every meeting a collaborative team is having, they're trying to answer those 4 questions. And those 4 questions can't be answered at one meeting every time that a meeting is addressing all 4 questions, because it's a part of a cycle that those questions actually get addressed. In fact, in our book, we actually advance that schools should stop trying to answer those questions. If you're doing the right work, then those questions will be answered as a consequence of doing the right work.
And we'll share with you just in a moment a little bit of what that looks like before we finish. So what I want to do here is just bring it all together, because what we've outlined and what we would propose are the absolute essentials that schools and the staff within a school understand the meaning of and the implications for it for collaborative teams. And then we'll bring this together, and then before we finish, we'll just outline just briefly the cycle that is really the big part of the book, and that we help schools work through, and that we'll give you a whole lot of tips around in the next session. So in terms of bringing it together, the whole school is, if you think of the metaphor of an orange, the whole school is the skin. It's the outside, and the professional learning community is that skin. And within the orange are the collaborative teams that serve it. We have had a bit of fun with this with many of our colleagues that we've worked with. We had colleagues ask us, so what are the PIPs? But I'll let you work that one out. But we've got the professional learning community being the skin. It's the whole school that helps to hold and create the conditions for those collaborative teams to thrive. Without the skin of the orange, those segments of the orange rot a lot quicker. And what we want to make sure that we do is create the conditions to support and have those collaborative teams thrive. So the PLC is the orange, the collaborative team serves the orange. In another body of work that I was involved with, collaborative teams that transform schools, that's why we titled the book that way. It's collaborative teams that transform the school, and the school is the PLC. But we have a responsibility to helping create the conditions for those teams to thrive, including understanding what this work means and looks like, hence a lot of the stuff we've gone through in this session. Okay.
It's really, sorry, Gav, I was just going to say
right.
It's really interesting. We're talking here about the PLC being the whole orange, the outside skin of that orange. The definition of a PLC that we've shared with people tonight is the definition of a professional learning community, and it is also that definition of a collaborative team. To us, the definition is the same, but what we're trying to make sure people do, it's not just about this is the work of teams. To become a professional learning community, it is the work of the whole school. There are certain things that need to be put in place, certain supportive structures that need to be put in place to allow the collaborative teams to do the work that they need to focus on to improve student learning.
Thank you. So summing up, we would say a pseudo-professional learning community is one where collaborative teams get together and can complete tasks. They get things done. And these things still need to happen in schools, but they don't form the basis of the most important work collaborative teams work on. In an authentic professional learning community, what happens is as these tasks are getting worked through, educators are learning as a result. And it's the educator learning that is supporting higher levels of learning for the students that they serve on a regular basis. And that's the fundamental difference. So then the question becomes, so what are those tasks that those teams are focused on that are going to bring about that high level of educator learning? And we'll just touch on that before we finish. So summing up, if you think about it like this, every cycle of learning or unit of instruction, whatever it might be referred to in your school, is an action research into improving teaching practice. So every time you implement anything, it's your team's opportunity to hold action research into improving your teaching practice. But whilst that's going on, if you look at the work of the whole orange, there's action research going on into that action research to improve teaching practice. And that's the work of the whole school. That's the work of the leadership team, work of middle leadership, as we continue to support and create these conditions. And we don't have a lot of time to go into that, but that's what it means. So summing up, professional learning community, the action research and recurring collective cycles of learning, that is the continuous school improvement. That's what constitutes, that's what brings you the continuous school improvement. That's where the action is at. So going on into the last part, we just want to share with you the cycle of learning and I guess the frame that we use to help teams, to collaborative teams to do this. And then we'll dig deeper into that next time. Cole.
In this section, we're talking about a team that has come together around the common learning content that they're delivering. So the common thread of the way the teams have been formed in a school is based on the fact that they are going to be delivering similar or the same content to the cohort of students that they serve. And that's framed up, if you go back and look at the questions. Question number one, what do we want students to learn, actually means that teams are delivering the same or similar content. That's what they're collaborating on. That's what their meeting is going to be about. In the work, in our book, Collaborative Teams That Work, we see the cycle of learning as having three distinct phases. The first phase is preparing the learning. And what the team is doing here is getting ready for the upcoming cycle of learning. What they're trying to do here is do some of the planning to make sure that their first teaching is as strong, as impactful as possible as they prepare the learning. So the 5 actions that make up the preparing the learning phase of the cycle of learning are mapping the learning pathway, determining the student's current learning reality, if necessary, administering some pre-assessment so we've got a really up-to-date picture of what their current learning reality is, responding to those learning needs, planning out, okay, if this is where the students are at, what might we do about this? And that then consequently leads to that designing of the learning program. So there are the 5 actions that we see frame up the first phase of the cycle of learning, preparing the learning.
So I know in this we don't have time to go into this in great depth because within each of the 3 phases of this action learning cycle, there are up to 50 tasks that teams undertake. And this is where the real action research for us over 12 years has happened, is when you see these teams working at the highest level, we've come to understand what those who are succeeding do, and in some ways what those who aren't succeeding as much are not doing. But the really important part is now that we're implementing the learning, the program, the second phase here is around implementing the learning. And this is where most of the collaborative team time is spent during the cycle of learning. And what we're doing is just monitoring the impact of instruction in our classrooms on an ongoing basis, which is obviously just what good teachers are already doing on a regular basis. And then in our collaborative teams, we're coming back to analyse which of those instructional practices are having the greatest impact. And if we're meeting weekly, we're able to do that on an ongoing basis through the course of that unit of work, which is so powerful because what we can then do, of course, is adopt the most impactful instructional practices now when the students are needing it the most. And that continues to inform the learning program, and then we go around again and again based on how long the unit is, how long the cycle of learning is, how much time you've got to meet, and a whole range of other factors. But the implement and the learning is the critical part for the teaching practice piece we mentioned before.
And the last phase of the cycle of learning has 3 actions there, and it's really where we're reflecting on and reviewing the learning that the team has taken away from what they have just implemented. So this phase ensures teams draw conclusions from the action research they undertook regarding successful teaching practices as they implemented that learning program, which they were going to implement anyway. So it's a more of a formal chance to celebrate the learnings that they've made and to discuss how they might share those learnings and carry those learnings through, as Gavin mentioned before, to the next cycle of learning. How are they going to share the things that they've discovered in their team with other teams that might also benefit from the research they've been conducting? So the actions in this are to administer the post-assessment so we can determine, the impact we've had on student learning, determine the team's impact on student learning, and then to action the team's learning, how we can carry those forward and share the good research and the good learning that the team has made with other teams in the school.
And in their own team as they continue to sort of spiral through. So earlier on in this webinar, I talked about the how, and a lot of the questions we got was the how. This is the how. And we would propose that when aspects of this are missing from your teams, then it reduces the potential for what you can do as a collaborative team. Associated with each of these actions, there are a multitude of tasks that teams work through, some dependent upon their context and so forth. And what we want to do for you next week, or whenever the next session is to give you just a tip for each of these to make sure that they can work in with where you're at in your journey as collaborative teams here as well. So just summing up before we stop and open it up for some questions, where we've got to here in this is that the relationship between a PLC and collaborative teams is you've got the whole school, which is, of course, we refer to as the PLC, which is the orange skin. Inside, you have the collaborative teams that are serving it. They're helping to transform the school. They're the engine to your ongoing school improvement. But really importantly, in terms of what those collaborative teams are doing, they are working through cycles of learning and attending to the most critical tasks that are addressing the 4 critical questions by taking, we would argue, 12 non-negotiable actions and learning those deeply and refining those as they continue to do the work in their school. And once we get real clarity around those, what each of these words mean, and once we get clarity around how that cycle of learning can operationalize these words that you see here on the screen, then you are really elevating your school's PLC efforts to the next level. And that's why in this session we wanted to outline to you these really key pivotal terms to collaborative teams that work. Okay, so just then finishing off here with a quote before we do stop and take any questions you may have. We really love this. We think this really sums things up from the context of a collaborative team, because when your clarity meets your commitment, as mentioned earlier, and you apply action to the problem, your world will begin to transform before your eyes. And, we're converts to this because we've seen it work. It's worked in our schools. It's worked in the schools that we've worked with. It's certainly been instrumental in the work that Colin and I have done together over the years. And we can't find or see another way that's going to meet the needs of students and teachers now and into the future more than this work. It's just so critically important. So we just want to say thank you before we do open it up for questions for joining us here today. But before we go, I think we've got a bit of time. We might just open it up and see if there are any questions. We're happy to talk just briefly about some of those.
Thank you so much, Gavin and Colin. We have had a couple of questions already. So Chelsea is asking, will you be discussing the 11-step cycle for secondary teachers?
Cole?
We will flag it indeed and go through, because it is a little bit different in terms of the starting point. In this one, we're talking about starting from content. Also in the book, we have the cycle unpacked to the 11 actions for secondary schools or teams that can't come or aren't formed around the actual content. So we'll try and make sure we do flag that as well and give some information, some tips around that model as well.
Just in the book, of course, we differentiate a primary school and a secondary school model, but the model that we've just outlined to you today, we work we work in high schools secondary schools with. Having said that, it's not always. We've got a question here, Colin, about how do we build teams in a small primary school, 6 classes only, for example.
Yep. And I think what I was going to say, Gav, sorry, the reason we highlight starting from the common content is we understand from our work in schools over the last 15 years that nothing gives you the impact on student learning is when the teachers come together and it's around the common content. We understand, as you were saying, Gav, that in some schools the structures might not allow that, so we do have an alternative, but would hate to think that schools flip to the alternative only because they prefer the alternative without putting some real serious thought about how might we reconfigure our teams to make sure we can come from content. If you can't, fine, there's an alternative.
So summing up, because this is an issue for many people, we basically frame up 2 cycles, one that has 12 actions, one that has 11. This one, because it has the most impact around the ones that share content, but where not possible, it doesn't matter if it's primary or high school, but where not possible, that there are these 11 actions that still address 4 critical questions and ensure that you're trying to get the most for your students. So,
and it's also based on the same definition of a PLC, so that work we did today underpins both.
Yeah.
So I've got another one here from Michelle, sorry. What is the cycle timeline? How long would a cycle be? How long would a cycle be to be effective?
Gav, do you want to do that one or want me?
All I would say is it depends. I mean, there's no one answer to that, because what I would be asking, what's your cycle of learning now? Remembering that we're talking a cycle of learning really is how long do you give a current unit of instruction? Because that becomes your cycle. And that's what you apply this cycle to in terms of the time that you're given it. So a lot of that depends on how you organise curriculum, what your current sort of pacing guides are or curriculum planning is, how many units you've got sort of set out over the course of a term or a year or a subject, depending on your context. And then you apply, I think, Colin, you said this earlier, you apply that then cycle and what you learn and what you're understanding about their cycle to that unit of work. And in some cases, I've worked with schools where it's 5 weeks, and for others, it's been 10 weeks. And in other schools, there's a whole semester. So it kind of depends.
And it depends on that answer to question number 1, what do you want the students to learn? So based on what your answer to that question will dictate how long this might take. And also factoring in that, which Gav mentioned, is depending on the frequency of meetings that are happening in the school. If it's a weekly meeting, quite clearly you can actually get through the cycle quicker. If it's a longer, you're meeting every 2 weeks, then it may take longer to get through that cycle.
What is the maximum number of recommended staff members in each team? We are a huge school and conflicted about how to form our collaborative teams. That's from Kim.
I'm only laughing not because I'm laughing because it's a very common question, and I appreciate the complexity of that. But there is no ideal, really. There is no ideal. It's about purpose. And depending on the size of the team will also depend on the nature of how it's facilitated and what you have to bring to the team. And that's probably more important because the teams will operate a little bit differently. So it's depending on the size will depend on how you need to facilitate or what tools and protocols you need to bring in to ensure, regardless of the size, it's productive. I think that's just the short answer. I could go a long time with that one. Cole, did you want to add anything there?
No, I think that's right. I think certainly you want, if it's a problem-solving team, then you want a number of different points of view present and around the table at a collaborative team meeting, so you do have a genuine exchange and bouncing of ideas and exploring possibilities. So I think there's a whole lot of factors that will impact on that. And really, if you're looking at that outside circle of action research that the leadership team is doing, that's one of the things they could be investigating, forming their teams, looking at and observing how they're working, getting feedback from the team. Oh, our team's too big. We're not, we can't have the depth of discussion we want. That would then inform what the next iteration of teams might look like at the school, because the leadership team should always be carrying out that action research to assist and support the work of teams.
So purpose before size could aid that conversation. And Thea, just before I'm happy to stay on obviously a few more minutes to help people here, but there was just a question about a model for specialist schools where students in each class are taught using differentiated learning, not the same content for each student, Colin. And I just wanted to say, well, yes, in the book we actually give an example of that, but it's the same cycle we'd apply with the 11 actions to that very scenario.
Right, yeah.
So yes, it's applicable. I just wanted to say that because someone asked. Sorry, Thea.
And I think there's a really well-written example of that in our book.
Yes, was that the bit you wrote? Okay.
Val has asked, how does your cycle of learning fit with the DEETs, S's, action research?
So, Colin, I think the question's more around how it sits with the Victorian education departments.
I think it's congruent with it because it's coming from the same basis of action research. We are just really strong advocates that action research should be based on as much as possible the real work that teachers were going to do anyway, rather than it being seen as an extra. I've seen in some teams where they go in and they go to the meeting and do the work of the meeting, investigating something which might be quite interesting in terms of a high impact teaching strategy they're going to investigate and implement, and then they come out and do their real work. So I think it's a case of us being really strong advocates saying that question number one, what do we want the students to learn? If that can form the basis of the action research, teachers are more likely to engage in the process, not see it as extra work, but also improve student learning.
In fact, I think, Colin, it'd be fair to say one of the shared passions we have, and one of the reasons we went to such lengths to make sure we could get this book out, was because we want this to become the DNA of the school and not feel as though it's something extra. Because that, it shortchanges the whole process, and that's what we've felt a frustration around, is it doesn't have to be that way. This can be the way we go about our core business, right?
And I think we recognise that teachers are busy people and we're always time poor in schools. Then if we can have these discussions, this action research around, the stuff we were going to be doing anyway, then I think it just has more, resonance with staff and teachers in schools going, it supports our work, it's not a distraction from our work.
Yeah.
Lorraine is asking, should we belong to only one CT team, or C team, collaborative team, sorry.
That's all right. Should we only belong to one?
One, yeah.
Again, it's a bit of depends on the context, right? What we don't want is to have people meeting so often that they don't have time to do all the other things that are associated with their role. And I think that question's, without passing the buck, that question's best served for the leadership teams who are doing that action research into the best ways of creating an environment for doing this. Because what we want to make sure is that our resources, our best resources, our greatest resources, our teachers, are meeting in collaborative teams where they're going to have the greatest impact, but where possible, and within reason based on all of the other things that we have to do.
And I think, Gav, I would add to that, it's sometimes in a secondary school, there's a real quandary in terms of I teach science, I teach this subject and this subject. I would say, exactly as you've answered, you can be on far too many teams and be ineffectual. What I would say is that if you were on one team, even though you're teaching those other subjects, we're on one team, the things you're learning around your teaching practice will transfer into those other areas anyway. So I think it's really important that it's about, not necessarily doing it in every subject area you teach if you're a secondary school, because I think you'd go around the twist in terms of trying to do it. And you wouldn't do the process justice, and therefore you would weaken the outcomes you were going to get. So I think you're right, Gav. It's again something a school would, and that's why they call the book, the DeFore's called the book Learning by Doing. Do it, trial it, review it, evaluate it, do the action research on it, and you'll come up with a better iteration of it next time you actually implement it.
And one last piece to that, Colin, the importance of the leadership team in creating some opportunity for vertical collaboration where teams can learn from other teams about how they're going about their business, because that just takes that learning to the next level. It's more a structural question, of course, but... Okay, I think we might have time for one more, Thea.
Okay, so I've got Val. When would you see an improvement in achievement after using your 12 actions in the cycle of learning?
You can see it when you get to action number 9.
8 or 9, yeah.
8, yeah.
8.
So when you should be able to see, if you've been doing the process with fidelity, you should be able to see improvements in student learning as you're going through, because you're adjusting your teaching practice in real time. You're not waiting until the end or waiting until the end of the year to make these changes. You're changing your practice in real time to impact on student learning on a daily basis.
Which is what you would do ordinarily as a teacher, right? You're just doing it within that collaborative context. I think one thing just to finish with here, Thea, that's really important to note is that we're not looking at this cycle and saying we must apply the cycle. What we're really wanting for teams to do is to look at the work they're currently doing and, of course, look at their structures and shift things around to make it optimal. But as they're doing the work, utilise this as their sort of definitive guide to help them do the work that they were going to do so they continue to get better at it, rather than see it as something that they've got to, bring down on what they're already doing. In fact, that's the very problem we're trying to help people solve. And so if you're doing that, then the answer yes to that question would be sort of, 8 or 9 as you start implementing the cycle.
Great. So thank you so much, Gavin Cole. We'll wrap it up here. Thanks everyone for your time this afternoon. Thank you for your time and expertise, and thank you for taking time out of your days. We really appreciate what you guys do. So we look forward to seeing you on the 22nd of October. There was a question about sharing the hashtags, so we will do that afterwards. And don't forget that the book is available in December, so you can pre-order it now. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Colin.
Thanks, everyone.
Colin.
Thanks, Gav.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone, for joining us. Appreciate it. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.